Horror is my favorite genre, not just of books, but of comics, video games, films, TV shows, all fiction. I love horror. And if you're here, you probably love horror too. So for that reason, I'm not going to be covering any books that are too obvious. The books of Stephen King, James Herbert, Peter Straub, classics like Frankenstein and Dracula, the works of Shirley Jackson, Daphne du Maurier. You've probably read all of those. So I'm going to focus on a few modern horror books that you may or may not have read. 10 modern horror books that I think deserve your attention. If you've read them, great, good for you, you've got good taste. If you haven't, you should find something here that you love. I should also state that I'm only doing 10 here. If you want more, read my full article. And so I'm skipping over a few big names like Paul Tremblay, Joe Hill, some authors from around the world like South Korea's Pyeong Hae-yong and Argentina's Agustina Bastarrica, although there is one Argentinian book here. Anyway, let's crack on. Here are 10 horror books that you may not have read that you should definitely check out. First up is The Twisted Ones by American author T. Kingfisher. I am slowly and steadily making my way through everything that she has ever written. I started with What Moves the Dead, which is a retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, and this is her longest book, a real intense horror novel. The Twisted Ones tells the story of a girl called Melissa who goes by Mouse. Her grandmother, who was a horrible, twisted, curmudgeonly, nasty woman, has just died over the age of 100, and she was a hoarder. And so Mouse's dad, who's in his 80s, says, look, can you go to grandma's house and just sort it out? Get everything nice and organized. And so she says, yeah, sure. So she goes and she stays in this house that's pretty rural for a few days, sorts through all the crap. But while she's there, she discovers things. Her grandmother, later in life, remarried this pretty chill and friendly Welshman. He kept diaries. And he saw things. He believed in these occult fairy people, strange kind of pre-modern pagan creatures. He saw them when he lived in Wales, and he's seen them in the US. And Mouse is trying to paint a picture of what exactly he sees. And of course, we know that soon she will see it too. There are things in the woods outside of this house. The titular Twisted Ones. Strange creatures. What do they want? What do they do? Are they dangerous? If so, how and why? There's a lot of questions here, and it goes to some trippy, strange, and really eerie places. I really enjoyed this one. Come Closer by Sarah Gran. First off, just look at this cover. Everything about this cover is gorgeous. The font style, the subtle shininess of it, the blood redness, the minimalism, the eye drawing here. I love this cover. It's so great in its minimalism and its simplicity. I sometimes just stare at this. Bloody beautiful. It's got makeup smudges on it. Did I do that? Of course I did. Oh my god. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, if you're a fan of Rosemary's Baby, the book or the film, you're going to really enjoy this one. It's a really short, brilliant horror novel about a young woman who's possessed. How or why doesn't really matter. It's the story of her possession slowly getting worse, escalating into madness. It begins with a really funny moment where she's in her generic office job and she leaves a report on her boss's desk. And when he looks at it, he screams and he orders her into his office and he says, "What is this?" And it turns out it's just a stream of abuse that she wrote. But she doesn't remember writing that. She insists it must be a prank pulled by someone else. She didn't write this. She left him a report and someone switched it out. That's the first sign. Next, she starts hearing strange noises in the walls of her apartment. She blacks out. She doesn't remember doing things. It gets worse and worse. This is a really fun, engaging possession story where you're constantly looking for answers and wondering what the hell is going to happen next, how it's going to up the ante even further. It's really short. I read it in a day. I picked it up on a whim as well, and I'm so glad that I did. Come Closer is a great story of possession. A classic horror book written with a more modern sensibility. Very Rosemary's Baby. I loved this one. My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones is a lot of different things. Most obviously, it's a kind of homage to slasher fiction, Our protagonist is a young Native American girl who is failing out of high school because she's too busy being obsessed with her hobbies. She is a fanatical horror obsessive. She has an encyclopedic memory and knowledge about everything to do with slasher fiction, especially slasher cinema. And just as she's kind of preparing to take her exams and graduate high school, a slasher seems to be playing out in her hometown, which is going to add a lot of distraction to her life. It's quite meta in its narrative, the fact that it is a slasher that is affecting the life of someone who is the world's biggest slasher fan and obsessive. She spends the entire novel remarking on specific tropes of the genre and referencing films that you've probably never even heard of. If you love slashers, which I do, you'll get a lot out of this. And it's definitely a book that's trying to appeal to slasher fans. But as I said, it's also a Native American book. The author is Native American, and so is the protagonist. And it's a book that talks about white nationalism, oppression, and all of the themes that you would expect a Native American to tackle, especially smartly while talking about horror cinema, Hollywood, things that are famously white. It's a really fascinating one. An homage to slasher fiction, but also a very, very smartly political book as well. Chuck Wendig has become known for writing really good comic books and some great sci-fi novels, but here is a standalone epic horror novel. It stands at 500 pages, so it's a pretty meaty Stephen King-esque thing. The Book of Accidents is pretty wild. It starts simple and really, really escalates. Our protagonists are a family of 3. Mother, father, teenage son. They've moved from Philadelphia, where they all lived and worked for a long time, into a small rural community. The reason they've moved is twofold. One, the house they move into was actually the father of the family's childhood home, and his father has just died and left them the house. And the other reason is that their son is a really sensitive kid. He's not having a good time. He gets bullied a lot. He feels very isolated. I hugely related to this kid, honestly. And so this is kind of an opportunity for a fresh start, a smaller, more quiet, calm community life, away from the hustle and bustle of big city living. But the father of the family has inherited this house from his dad, who was an absolute monster. He worked at a prison, he executed criminals, and he abused his own family when he was at home. He was a stereotypical drunk abuser. On his deathbed, he gives his son this house for $1, and it's strange. And the hauntings start pretty soon, but these hauntings are weird. And as we follow the son's narrative, he becomes friends with a group of nerds who play D&D, and also one punk kid. One really weird punk kid who definitely wants something from him. So there's a lot going on here. You've got hauntings, you've got childhood trauma, but you've also got a mysterious local punk kid who wants something from one of our protagonists. And the mother is also experiencing strange dreams and feverish, if that's a word, things. You'll see. This is a horror novel that bleeds into the sci-fi in some really fun, unexpected ways. I've talked about this book a lot. Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt was my favourite novel of 2021. It's one of the best British horror novels you'll ever read. It's an important political piece of transgender fiction, and it's very, very bold and daring and frightening. This is a novel about transphobia, about bigotry, about fascism, and about the state of Britain right now. Our protagonists are 2 women, a young trans woman and her former friend who has become a bigoted, gender-critical TERF. How did this happen? How did their friendship fall apart? And how did the one friend become so radically transphobic? Well, when they were at university together, they spent a night at a haunted house, and something terrible happened in that house that drove these 2 girls apart and traumatized both of them. Now one of them has been radicalized into an abusive cult, and the other is being haunted. What the hell happened? We learn a lot about this house, the fact that it's called Albion and it's an obvious metaphor for Britain, and about the lives of these 2 women, how we become radicalized, how Britain is transphobic and why. And it's also a really gritty, gruesome, nasty, frightening horror book. An absolute must-read that I love so much. Another book by a transgender author, Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. This is a post-apocalyptic American horror novel, again about transphobia. Our protagonists are a pair of two trans girls trying to make their way journeying through a post-apocalyptic zombie-filled landscape. A virus took hold of all of humanity, and this virus in particular targets testosterone. So most cis women, most trans women, and some trans men are safe from this virus. But most cisgender men have succumbed to this virus and turned into aggressive, predatory, brain-dead, dangerous, zombie-like cannibals. And despite how dangerous the landscape now is, there is also a cult of transphobic women who've decided that hunting trans women is more important than just surviving because of their single-minded obsession with a thing they've decided to hate. And our protagonists must survive both this terrifying zombie-infested landscape and the hunters who've decided to go after them. This is a very, very gnarly, bloody, grotesque book. If you can't stand bloodshed, cannibalism, really gnarly body horror, and generally twisted behavior, give this one a miss. If you can stand all of that, and even enjoy it, you'll love this. Eric LaRocca is now my favourite horror writer, bar none, and this is his debut full-length novel. He's written loads of great short stories and novellas, and I've read all of them, and this is everything the darkness eats. Even though it's a full-length novel, it's still pretty short and a little over 200 pages long, and we begin in Wales with a dig site. A group of archaeologists and excavators have discovered something, and the man leading this excavation has found what he wanted, which was a cave full of strange drawings, and he doesn't want anyone else to discover whatever this thing is. So he blows up everyone else's heads using some strange eldritch magic. It's shocking and weird and a great prologue. And from there, we spend time in a small rural town in New England, where this man now lives. His name is Hart Crowley, and he is definitely responsible for all of the strange disappearances that are going on in this town. People are just going missing. Most of them elderly. They're vanishing, and Crowley is definitely kidnapping these people and putting them in his basement. But why? There's something strange and eldritch and dark going on here. As a queer writer, LaRocca often puts queer characters and queer themes in his books, and this is no different. One of our protagonists is a gay man who is married, and the two of them are suffering abuse. They are under threat from someone. People throwing bricks through their windows and threatening to abuse and beat them up. Our other protagonist is a man in his 30s who lost his wife and is just being tormented. Quite literally, there is some sort of strange spirit that has latched itself onto him and is tormenting him and whispering strange things in his ear. These two protagonists have nothing to do with each other, but they both somehow get wrapped up in what's going on in this town and what this villainous kidnapping man is up to. There's a lot of different threads going on here, all within the same time and space, and they all eventually overlap as the horror escalates and as something Lovecraftian comes to light. I love this book. I always love what Eric LaRocca does. He is my absolute favourite best boy, and you should check out Everything the Darkness Eats. Laura Purcell is another favourite of mine. I've read all of her books. I love her. She is my favourite British horror writer. And so trying to pick one book of hers was really, really tough. Her fifth novel, The Whispering Muse, might be my favourite. Her second novel, The Corset, is arguably her best. But I'm picking this, her first book, The Silent Companions, mostly because if you haven't read her before, this is where I started, and this is where I recommend you start too. And also because this is just a very, very good haunted house book, a dedication to Shirley Jackson, to stories like The Turn of the Screw, the works of Daphne du Maurier, and arguably even the Brontes. Definitely very Susan Hill-esque. This is a novel about a haunted house in Victorian England. Our protagonist is a recently widowed pregnant woman. Her husband died before their child was even born, and now the only place for her to go is her husband's rural country estate. So she goes there. She goes to live in this creepy old mansion. There are servants there, and she quickly becomes best friends with her husband's cousin who also lives there. But there is something dark in this house. Something haunting. Something that begins in the attic and starts to move down. I love this. This is just proper haunted house goodness. If you love The Woman in Black, if you love Shirley Jackson, if you love haunted houses in general, you need to read this book and then go through all of her other stuff. It's all historical fiction, it's all creepy, it's all gothic, it's all yummy goodness. I adore Laura Purcell. Another author whose books I struggle to choose between is Grady Hendrix. I love his works. I adore the way he titles his books. I'm slowly making my way through everything he's written. The Final Girl Support Group, My Best Friend's Exorcism, I love those books, but I've picked his newest at the time of recording, How to Sell a Haunted House. And honestly, I'm picking this because I think it's his best book. This is a classic American horror story about a haunted house, but it's also a very intense family drama. That's something that Grady Hendrix does really well, is he puts his characters, their personalities, their dramas, their relationships at the forefront, and the haunting, the horror happens in the background, creeping slowly forward as it goes, until it's in the spotlight, until it's something you can't ignore, until it is really, really terrifying. And this is him doing that better than he ever has. Our protagonist is a woman who lives in San Francisco, but she's originally from a small town somewhere in New England or the Midwest, I can't remember where exactly. And her parents, who are in their 70s, have just died in a car crash. Her brother, who's a bit of a loser, never left his hometown, and when she goes back to organize the funeral and the house and the will, she and her brother clash a lot. She's had to leave her daughter behind with her ex in order to sort all of this out, and she's really, really stressed. Her brother is a barman in a local pub. He's a bit useless, and the two of them are just constantly butting heads over what to do and whether or not they should sell the house. And then the haunting starts. Something trippy, strange, creepy, and eerie is going on here. What is this haunting? Who is it? Is it their parents? If so, why? If it isn't, then who? There's a lot of questions going on, while the family drama remains at the forefront. Brilliant book, brilliant author. Check out everything he's written, but this is definitely his best. And finally, we have an enormous epic. This was probably my favorite book of 2022, Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This was translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell, and it is an incredible epic piece of Argentinian political horror. Up until this point, Enriquez has written a bunch of short stories across 2 collections, and she hasn't written a normal-sized 300 to 400 page novel. She skipped all of that and wrote this enormous 800-page epic. And it's incredible. This is a book in 3 acts, 3 very distinct parts, and it blends classic Americana-style horror, very Stephen King, with dark academia, and most importantly, Lovecraftian eldritch cult horror. There is a cult that is spread across the entire planet that worships some eldritch being. They commit atrocities and sacrifices and terrible things in order to maintain wealth and power. Our protagonist is an Argentinian man who has a special power as a medium. He can talk to this eldritch god, and so they use him as a tool to open up a conversation pathway. His son has this same power, and he wants to save his son from this same fate, and so they are running. They are on the run across a dangerous landscape at a time when Argentina had a military dictatorship. As the book goes on, as I've said, it moves from eldritch horror to very Stephen King-esque Americana into dark academia. It moves through time, through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It's an incredible journey, and it is scary in so many different ways, but most importantly, it is a political, savvy piece of Lovecraftian horror. I love this book. It is so smart. It is an absolute masterpiece of political fiction, literary fiction, and horror. Perfect. It's perfect. It's not often a book this long can justify its own size, but this does. I love this book. If you haven't read Our Share of Night, you really need to, as long as you don't mind its length. There you go. Those were 10 fantastic horror novels that I wholeheartedly recommend. If you enjoyed this, if you love me doing these big lists of great things that I recommend, support me on Patreon if you have the funds. I would love your support. Without my patrons, I wouldn't keep doing what I do. And if you have the money to spare, throw me $1. As I said at the very beginning, there's lots and lots of horror books I've missed out, a lot of great classics, a lot of great modern ones, short story collections, novellas, blah blah blah, but here are 10 novels that I need you to check out if you love horror and you haven't checked them out already. So go do that, support me on Patreon if you can, and subscribe for books.